Hello, welcome back to Rev Endurance Sports and another edition of What is in Our Stand Today. So today we are going to talk about the Quarq power meter and the installation, a little bit about dub bottom brackets and what is the dub stand for, and hopefully we'll do some video cuts here and there and hopefully get an installation going as well. Okay. But before we go any further, if you've been coming onto the channel, I appreciate you. And if you've been liking the content, I appreciate you. Please show a little bit of love and subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. Okay, well, let's get going. So this customer came to me wanting to put power onto his gravel bike. And he's used to seeing power numbers at home, so you know, this is one of those situations where we want to see it out on the road or dirt trail, whatever. There's a couple of ways to do power out in the dirt, but the most protected place to have your power meter is on your crankset. There are power meter pedal hacks, and there are some options as well for power meter pedals for the mountain bike side. Not many, but a couple. But, you know, pedal strikes and rocks and crashes and all that stuff, I'm of the opinion that the crank-based for mountain biking and graveling is probably the best option. Your mileage may vary, your opinion may vary, and that's great. That's why there's so many different power meter options. So let's talk about what we are going to install on this customer's bike. So first and foremost, we are going to take this power meter spider sorry for that, and you know, if you look closely, this is basically some assembly required modular system. Now, this is a Quarq power meter, and it's a spider power meter, which means that the chain ring will get bolted onto these 4 bolts here, and the crank arm is going to get bolted onto these bolts here. So you can choose the crank arm length, you can choose the chain ring size, and then just put it all together, which is what we're going to do today. Now, inside this box, along with the power meter, which let's just set that there for now, you're going to get 2 bags, and this bag here is the bolts that you need to secure your crank arm to the spider. And those will get torqued on by this little guy here, and it's 4 Newton meters, so it's not really a lot of torque. Then you're also going to get a bag of bolts and a nice finishing kit here so that you have a nice transition from the chain ring to the spider, and it's nice and neat. So that's going to be torqued on with this. And I believe it's 12 Newton meters. And you don't have to memorize these things, because if you look closely, you'll see that they put on here the torque values so you don't screw that up. So right here, you can see that that's 12 Newton meters. Let me turn this so you can read it. So that's 12 Newton meters. And then when you're putting in the screws to hold the crank arm on, there it is right there at 4 Newton meters. So 12 for the chain ring and 4 for the bolts. So it takes the guesswork out of it, takes the memorization out of it, and that is a good way to get your product in consumers' hands or mechanics' hands and not get it stripped or over-torqued or broken. So here are the crank arms. So this is your crank arm, And it'll segue nicely into the bottom bracket situation that we have for this. So these are SRAM red crank arms. And as you can see there, it says dub. And that is something that we're going to talk about next. And then here's the other crank arm, which we are going to bolt onto the spider. Okay, so let's set this aside. Well, let's take this guy out. And these are nice boxes, nice way to ship a product and give the consumer a real nice presentation when they're spending as much money as they are for these. We're going to use a 36 chainring because the customer, you know, being a 1x drivetrain, and we have a lot of steep climbs here, he'll have a 36 chainring up front and a 46 climbing cog on his cassette. Okay, so this is part of SRAM's new standards. Now, one thing as a mechanic and having seen this evolution, we've gone through an enormous amount of bottom bracket standards. So we started off with the basic stuff of a threaded bottom bracket, right? These two cups here, they thread into the frame, done. Outboard bearings, sealed, done. A very, very solid system. And it's usually for smaller crank spindle diameters. Generally 24 millimeters, Shimano being the most common. Incidentally, Shimano has never really bought into the BB30 or the larger bottom bracket crank arm spindles. In their own testing, they've said, you know what, that's not important to us. We want to use a steel spindle instead of an aluminum spindle. And so the quality standards for them is we want to use a 24 millimeter steel spindle instead of using a 30 millimeter crank arm spindle. Now I keep pointing to this and saying 30 millimeter just because that's the most common. But one of the things that Dub decided to do is say, okay, we've got so many different bottom bracket standards. We want to come up with something that is universal. So there you go, Dub for durable, U for universal, and B for bottom bracket. So a durable universal bottom bracket. And what they were looking for, which is interesting if you look at their information, they wanted to find something that was as durable as the 24 millimeter crank arm spindles, but had some of the benefits of lightweight as the 30 millimeter spindles. So what did they end up with? Well, they ended up with a 28.99. So again, another spindle standard, 28.99. So let's just call that 29 millimeter spindle. So now they have a 29 millimeter spindle. And because of that, you, finger quote, need to, finger quote, use their SRAM bottom bracket. Now, Wheels Manufacturing does make a 29 millimeter, and when we talk about 29 millimeter, we're talking about this inner diameter and this outer diameter. So 29, 29. And remember, it's 28.99, but we're rounding up, okay? And so if you are using the Dub cranksets, then you must use, again, finger quote, must use a SRAM Dub, because if you have a 30 millimeter standard bottom bracket from other folks, you have 1 millimeter of play, right? So if this is 29 and this hole is 30, you have 1 millimeter of play, and obviously that's not good. Okay, so what I want to talk to you briefly about also is how to measure your bottom bracket and how to choose the correct bottom bracket for your bike. So these are digital calipers. If you have these, great. If you don't, you kind of make do with some other measuring device. But let's walk over to the bike real quick and let me show you what are the important dimensions that you should take. The very first and easiest dimension to take is going to be, and if you look closely here, you want to use this portion of the caliper, and that should measure really close to 46, and you know, there it is, about 49.9, depends how hard you pull on the calipers. Okay, so you want to know what your ID, or inner dimension, inner diameter, okay, so that's either going to be somewhere around 42 or it may be around 46. You'll also see it listed as 41. Now, the next dimension that you want to take is the external width of your bottom bracket. So now, this is always a little harder to get, and I'm so fortunate to have a cameraman. But this dimension, you want to take from edge to edge, and this is going to be the OD. So ID, OD. You'll sometimes just see those abbreviations, and you'll have to know, what does that mean? So this is about 86 to 86.5 is usually what you're looking for here. And as you can see there, that's 86 and some change, right? So we have an 86-ish and a 46. So OD, ID. And once you have those specs, then you can appropriately choose the correct bottom bracket for your bike. The biggest challenge is always going to be getting the crankset out, getting the bottom bracket out so that you can take those measurements. Unfortunately, not everyone has the bike tools necessary. And so sometimes you're calling a bike shop, oh, I need a bottom bracket for my bike. And you say, I have a blah, blah, blah 2015 or 16 or something. And the mechanic is most likely going to say, either bring it in so I can take some measurements of it, or do you know the exact spec? Keep in mind that even if you have a certain measurement here, the previous owner of your bike, the previous mechanic, or even the OE, the original equipment manufacturer, might have put some type of variant in there that is not common, or maybe has adapters and it's not indicating the true bottom bracket that you need for your bike. So this is a huge pitfall, and with so many different options, it's really important to take exact measurements of your bike. Sometimes the spec can also, this has happened too, sometimes the spec on the manufacturer's site, let's say it's ABC Bike Company, mid-year they may change the spec. It may be a different bottom bracket from when you purchase your bike, even though it's the same model year. I know that that sounds crazy, but that has happened before. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to start doing some of the installation, but we're just going to mock it up real quick so you can see what it looks like. And then I'll go behind the scenes and actually put it together so that you don't have to get, so you're not bored with the, just putting the bolts and stuff on. So what we're going to do now is, if you look closely, there's going to be a few things here that match up, and you want to make sure that you have it set up that way. So excuse me while I get a few things ready. Okay, so we have our power meter, and we have our crankset, or crank arm, I should say. Okay, so you can see how that mates up there. And then that's what these bolts are for. Those will go in here. And as I mentioned before, the torque value is 4 Newton meters. Okay, so as I mentioned, I will do this behind the scenes because really you don't need to see me bolting that on there. Then you also have your chain ring, and now, if you notice, some of these have some shape to them and some do not. Can you see that? These are different. So basically you just play a little bit of a matching game. Oh, okay, well that one's got a little bit of scalloping going on there, so maybe that should go there. Okay, so you just match up the shapes to it. That one's going to go there. That goes there, and then more scalloping on this one. And you just kind of play that little game of round peg in the round hole, square peg in the square hole, and there you go. On the back side of this will be the bolts, and I will do that off screen, and we'll come back when we're installing all of this into the bike. Okay, we're back with the installation now of the bottom bracket. So we talked about earlier that you have to ensure that you have the proper measurements for this. So we have taken all the measurements required. We know that this is the correct bottom bracket for this. So now it's time to install it. Now, these bottom brackets, the cups come apart, okay? And so you have the cup, and then you have the spindle in the middle. And so what you do now is you install these one at a time, okay? So what we're gonna do now is, just to make our job easier and so that it goes in nice and smooth, is we have a position here, a little bit of grease, and we are now going to use a headset press, because basically this is just a headset but sideways. Okay, so we take our cup, put our cup in there like that, and you want to give it a little bit of a start with your hand. Like everything else, good mechanics will get a nice little head start with their hand on anything that they're installing to make sure that they are not cross-threading, or they're not putting it in sideways. Like in this case, there's no threads to cross-thread, but you can put it in sideways, and then you're trying to force it on there. So what we're going to do now is start turning this guy until it clicks. So you hear that? Then you turn, and if you look closely, what you want to do is make sure that this is going in evenly, because you don't want to crush. These are plastic, and so you don't want to crush that by improperly putting it in. So that little bit of grease that we put on there allows that to just get pressed in there nice and smooth without much effort and pressure on the bearings. So you just press, and once it's nice and flush, release it and release that cup. And now you'll just do the opposite on the other side. Now, they ship this protective little sleeve, which makes a lot of sense if you are using a much smaller press than what I'm using. So maybe if you had a press that is pressing here on the bearings, you would want to use this to protect the bearings. But I'm actually pressing on the outer side here. But I'll show you how to use this as well as we put in the second bearing. So now we're going to spin this a little bit around. And we're going to prep that again with just a little bit of grease. And if you've been watching my channel, you'll know that I pretty much grease everything, even when a manufacturer says, oh, that should have Loctite on it. Well, that's great in an ideal world, but I've seen things that are supposed to have Loctite on it, and because they have Loctite on it, they've not come out. And we need to get them out for a service of some sort. Okay, so now put that on there a little bit with my hand, and we're going to now use their little protective adapter. And we want to make sure that that all right. So what we're looking for is for this to go in there nice and flush, so that, as I mentioned before, we're not crushing anything, and we'll give it a nice snug, and then we take that out. And what we've done now is we've pressed in both cups. We use their protective adapter because we were able to press on the biggest portion here to make sure that we were able to push and press that bearing in there properly. Okay, so now we've got that, and the next thing we're going to do is install the crankset. Okay, so all right, now we're on to the second to last step, and what we're going to do now is we're going to install the crankset. So SRAM has a very good guide on their website to their dub system and what spacers and what your assembly should be based on the bottom bracket on your bike. So this is a 386 Evo. So the bottom bracket part comes with the spacer that you need. So we're going to put that spacer onto the crank arm, and then we're going to put the crank arm in from the non-drive side. Then we're going to put the crank arm on, the spider, which has the power meter. And this is kind of a balancing act because you have to put this on. Well, let's go back to this. You have to put this on as you're trying to push on there. Here we go. We got it. Okay, So before you go any further, you want to make sure you are 180 degrees opposite of your two crank arms. Okay, otherwise your customer is going to pedal funny, or if it's your personal bike, you're going to pedal funny. And now, if you look closely, right on this ring, you will see the torque value. It tells you it's an 8mm hex, and your torque value should be 54 Newton meters. So that's right there. So there's no guesswork. You know exactly what you need to put on there. And now starts the process of trying to torque this on there, because 54 Newton meters is a pretty significant torque. And there it is. If you watch the neck of the torque wrench, it breaks right there at 54. Spin the crank arm, spins great. And then there's one last part that, if you look closely on this side of the crank arm spindle, what you're going to see is this is your spring, your bearing preload. So you're just going to put that on there so that what you're trying to do is remove the play from side to side. And there'll be a spot where it's going to be just right. You'll have enough preload, and you won't have any noise either. So we'll keep working with that off camera, and next step will be putting on the chain. All right. And now the final installation part. Got the chain on there, worked it through all the gears, and these pedals are just on there so I can take it for a test ride, which I've already done. And I'm just shooting this video just to finish it off. Thank you so much for your time and attention. If you found the information useful and or entertaining, make sure you smash that like button and the subscription. We'll see you soon.